Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're diving into a land of absolute extremes and, honestly, some pretty wild contradictions. I mean, picture a country where you can literally dance the night away in a disco housed inside a 300-year-old stone castle and then go navigate a massive subterranean metro system in a major capital that features absolutely zero escalators. Those bizarre extremes? They're really just scratching the surface of what makes our topic today so fascinating. So, let's jump right in.
This brings us to the central paradox we're trying to unpack in this explainer. We're looking at a geographically isolated, seemingly peripheral country located way out on the extreme southwest edge of the Iberian Peninsula. It's essentially cut off from the rest of Europe, mostly just staring out into the vast Atlantic Ocean. Yet somehow, this tiny sliver of land managed to build an epic, world-spanning history that literally redrew the map of the globe. How does that happen?
Well, to really grasp this, I want you to hold a specific number in your head. 92,212. That's the current geographical footprint of Portugal in square kilometers. To put that into perspective, it's roughly the size of the Bonneville Salt Flats in the US or the African state of Guinea-Bissau. I want you to keep this incredibly small scale in mind as our baseline because it perfectly highlights the massive historical contrast we're about to explore together. All right, let's start at the beginning with Section 1, Roots of a Nation.
Long before there was any global empire, the Iberian Peninsula was basically defined by a chaotic turn of early inhabitants. Starting way back in 218 BC, the Romans conquered the region, and they brought with them what historians like to call an architectural ambivalence. It was this fascinating clash between the grand style of the Roman capital and the provincial, vulgar style of the local builders. Then in 418 AD, the Visigoths pushed their way in. They were followed by the Moorish invasion led by Tariq bin Ziyad in 711 AD, which completely and radically transformed the cultural and linguistic landscape of the south. Finally, out of this giant melting pot of Roman, Germanic, and Islamic influences, the independent Kingdom of Portugal officially emerged in 1157 under King Afonso I.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Age of Discoveries.
Now, this is where we see the most dramatic power shift in Portuguese history. Just check out this jaw-dropping contrast. In 1405, Portugal was this peripheral, mostly agrarian realm with a population of barely 1 million people, and 90% of them worked the land. Fast forward exactly 1 century, to 1505, and that exact same small nation had completely transformed into a central global empire. They were actively securing heavily fortified trade routes stretching all the way from the coasts of North Africa to India and eventually even Japan.
So how exactly did they pull this off? Well, it largely came down to the sheer audacity of a few specific navigators. In 1498, you have Vasco da Gama successfully circumnavigating Africa to establish a direct sea route to India. Just 2 years later, Pedro Álvares Cabral pushes the map westward, discovering Brazil. And by 1510, Afonso de Albuquerque conquers Goa, permanently breaking the traditional global spice monopolies. This was a total game changer. It allowed merchants back in Lisbon to absolutely thrive on luxurious goods like ivory and silk, while simultaneously pushing Renaissance ideas all the way across the oceans.
Which brings us to Section 3, Earthquakes and Empires. Of course, history is almost never a straight line of triumphs, right? In 1580, Portugal suffered a really bitter loss of independence. The nation was absorbed into the Iberian Union, which was a 60-year period where the Spanish Habsburgs, the Castilian crown, effectively took control of the vast Portuguese empire. This arrangement heavily crippled Portugal's monopoly-based trade backbone and sparked some pretty intense widespread discontent. This era of foreign rule finally ended on December 1, 1640, when the Portuguese nobility pulled off a coordinated coup d'etat to restore their own crown under King João IV. Then, a little over a century later, Portugal faced a literal collapse, the absolutely devastating 1755 Lisbon earthquake. But what's truly fascinating here is how the Marquês de Pombal responded to it. He rolled out these incredibly actionable, methodical steps to reconstruct the capital right out of the rubble. First, he ordered the ruins cleared. Then, he deliberately designed these wide streets and magnificent squares in what became known as the new Pombaline style. He actively pushed to recover external trade and eventually even helped establish the royal printing press, the Imprensa Regia. Because of his vision, Lisbon was basically reborn as Europe's first true urbanist capital, intentionally designed to look outward toward the infinite seas.
Okay, let's jump into the 20th century with Section 4, Dictatorship to Democracy. Here's where we run into another really profound historical paradox. From 1933 to 1974, Portugal was governed by the Estado Novo regime.
Led initially by Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, who was actually a former university finance minister, this became a 48-year conservative dictatorial regime. This government managed to maintain its grip on power through some very severe austerity measures, incredibly strict political censorship, and an organized secret police force that repressed political opposition and systematically dismantled civil liberties.
And this sets up one of the most stunning paradoxes in modern European history. Think about it. After 48 years of deeply oppressive rule, you would probably expect a violent, messy civil war, wouldn't you? But instead, on April 25, 1974, the military overthrew the Estado Novo regime in what became known around the world as the Carnation Revolution. Despite the heavy military involvement and the massive shift in national power, the entire revolution resulted in only 3 casualties. It was a shockingly peaceful overthrow of a deeply entrenched dictatorship.
There's this vivid quote from the source material that I think absolutely nails the essence of that day, bidding adieu to Baudelaire's disdain for the color of light arm revolution. What made this transition so iconic, so memorable, was the sensory detail of the moment. You had soldiers and regular citizens openly mingling in the streets, placing bright red carnations right into the barrels of the soldiers' rifles. It signaled to the entire world that this was going to be a completely bloodless transition to democracy, driven by the people and a military that simply refused to fire on them.
And that leads us to our final part, Section 5, Modern Paradoxes in Culture. Since officially integrating into the European Union back in 1986, contemporary Portugal has continued to be this fascinating land of contrasts. On one hand, the country has definitely faced some harsh economic realities, like hitting a public debt of 130% of GDP in 2012. That led to painful austerity cuts and the loss of public utility control to private corporations. But balancing that out, we see incredible triumphs. The public response to those hardships was characterized by uniquely peaceful democratic protests rather than violence. We also see the massive success of the 2007 Pent tourism strategy, which turned tourism into a booming, socially vital cornerstone of the economy, right alongside the continued global export of its rich culture and world-renowned wines. So, what does all of this mean for the complex Portuguese cultural identity today? Well, the source texts describe it exactly like this: a multi-ethnic, unloving, and multiple diasporic world. Now, that term unloving is interesting. It points to a history that wasn't always kind or heavily romanticized. But despite that, Portugal as a concept today totally transcends its own physical borders. Did you know 9/10 of the Portuguese-speaking community actually lives outside of Portugal? It's true. Its language, its literature, and its deep historical legacy live on in a massive global diaspora, from Brazil to Africa to parts of Asia, creating this shared community that is vast, plural, and profoundly interconnected. And that really leaves us with a final, provocative thought to chew on. We started all of this by asking how a tiny nation managed to change the globe. We've seen it endure earthquakes, build sprawling empires, suffer under dictatorships, and pioneer incredibly peaceful revolutions. So, as we look at this massive, global Portuguese-speaking community today, we have to ask, what ideals of progress are going to guide them into the future? How will this country of bizarre extremes and paradoxes, a country that already literally changed the world once, shape our tomorrow? It's a question that definitely leaves you wanting to learn more. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.